And bam. Hey, uh, everyone, friends, Romans, countrymen, lend me your ears. I got Maximilian Le Cain here. Le Cain or Le Cain?
Le Cain.
Le Cain.
And I've
See,
no
I,
idea
I,
where the name comes from.
I said only two, and I think we talked about this last time. I have this kind of Minnesota accent that I can extend vowels. So anytime I say something wrong, I could just blame that. So it's I got an excuse built in, and I appreciate you understanding and then also joining us. I think everyone that's going to be clicking on here watching already knows how amazing of a filmmaker you are and somebody that you not only have an original voice and personality to your creation. See another Minnesota slip up, but also a very beautiful voice. You're the Whitney Houston of experimental Irish cinema. So welcome to the Octopus Marquee.
Thank you. That's a lot to live up to already.
Oh,
I've no excuse for my slip-ups.
um,
Thank you for having me.
one of the things I noticed about when you are giving criticism, when you're talking about your own film and other people's film, you use this term that I recognize, yet was a little like, okay, and then have really almost embraced and fall in love with, but it's the idea of personal cinema. It's something you've used to describe either my work, other people's work, your own work. And I think we're all familiar with this idea of concepts of experimental cinema and how we use the word experimental in defining filmmaking. Um, but when you use the term personal cinema, uh, to you, what does that mean when you're using it? And then what is it about that you value?
Well, it comes down to a very simple formula, which is make the films that only you can make. And, this is something which I've talked about a lot with my friend Ruzba Rashidi as well. And we sort of hit on this formula together. So when I say personal cinema, it's not necessarily personal subject matter. It's personal everything. It's sort of reinventing film history for yourself, which sounds like a big one. Um, but I think film history, especially now and in recent years, we have this sort of monumental official received version of film, um, starting at the beginning, and then there's some sort of sense of a progression, or things sort of improving with time, evolving and developing, and all these factors bringing us to some sort of agreed upon notion of what cinema is, which is what's out there, and anyone sort of encountering cinema for the first time at any given moment in film history will sort of fall into this. And then I think if we want to make films, what's expected of us, or what we think is expected of us, is to find a way to fit into this. And then if we're doing something that's in any way personal, in any way different, it's sort of a case of matching up what we're doing against these rules and regulations. I think this is pretty obsolete, both as a way of thinking about the past, thinking about film history, and about sort of how to engage in it now. If you look back at film history, and these days with the internet, with we have such a wealth of accessibility to all sorts of cinema at the moment from all over the world, every period in filmmaking. I just keep flashing back every time I think about this to a time when, in 1997, a friend of mine lent me a VHS tape with two films by Straub Huillet, which they taped off TV 5 or 6 years before that, and said, "Well, I hope you enjoy these because this is the only time you'll ever get to see them." And 5 years ago or something, Mubi had all of their films to stream. So this is absolutely fantastic. We can really educate ourselves. We can really enjoy and explore and see all the many different things which cinema can be and can do, and see all of the many possibilities. And for me, early cinema is very important because it's always about going back to origins, going back to about what can cinema be. And I'm not just talking, or perhaps the least of it is sort of technology or technique. These days, filmmaking has become so accessible. People can just do things with their phones and they can be great. And they can be of a technical level, which perhaps 20 years ago, you'd really need a lot of money to accomplish. So, the framework's changed. And at the same time, so much has been done. It's almost as if there's a sense that every film has been made. What can you do differently? Well, what it comes down to is the bit about you. What can you do differently? If you take all the audiovisual influences which we pick up, and I think it's naive to say, unless you're living somewhere very isolated and really not watching anything, whether we like it or not, we are going to be influenced by the media. We are going to be influenced by audiovisual culture. So the thing is about being selective about that. Not necessarily about what we watch, maybe about what we watch, but how we process it, how we take it on board. And then turning that back to our own perception of life, our own perception of the world, both what's out there and the fact that, as I see it anyway, our bodies basically are filmmaking machines. We see, we hear, we sense, we edit in our minds, we edit from what we see. This is nothing too complicated, it's kind of obvious. And then the last step in that is projecting that back out, which is what filmmaking is. So if we take the world in, take whatever audiovisual influences we have in, pass them through our dreams, pass them through our bodies, and project them back out again. That's kind of what cinema is. And I think that's the job. That is how you reinvent film history, through yourself. And that's what I mean by personal cinema. That is the job of anyone making films today who's going to do anything worthwhile. It has to come through you. That's how you can be different. Everything else has been done. Filmmaking is, let's be honest, compared to how it used to be, it's so easy these days and so accessible. Anyone can do it. There's nothing that special about being able to go out and shoot a technically proficient film. It's not easy. You need, I don't want to, I don't want to rubbish technique or something, or rubbish technical skill. But if it's going to be special, it's about you and how you deal with those techniques. It could be someone working with a big Hollywood budget within that system and coming up with something really good, or it could be someone with no technical proficiency filming themselves in the bathroom with their little shaky phone on the camera and bad sound, whatever. And those two things can be equally marvelous, but it's it's you, and it's when you're absolutely turned loose. A couple of nights ago, for instance, and I'm just sort of using this as an example to show that it's not really about a particular setup. I saw the new Beetlejuice movie by Tim Burton, and I don't necessarily like all of his films. He wouldn't be one of my favorite directors, but I feel in this film he was just completely turned loose, and he was working with the freedom of someone who was just running around with their mobile phone. And I thought the results were absolutely superb. I'm still buzzing from watching that.
Oh, nice. Everyone watch Beetlejuice. It has the Maximilian seal of approval. Everything you were saying, it reminds me of like I for prep for this, and then in the past I've watched a few whether it was lectures of yours or uh, the reel you did for your website, and you referred to we are our own. I'm paraphrasing here. We are our own cinema apparatus. Um, And then also, I wrote this one down that cinema is up for grabs. Um, and then when I initially heard that, it created a lot of thoughts and it created a lot of concepts that we can all enter this lexicon of cinema. It's not this. I believe you called it it's not necessarily a monolith, or it's a monolith you can enter. Care to kind of like elaborate on that? That was something that I feel like it goes into exactly what you were saying, but this concept of through creating our own work and through viewing cinema and studying cinema to be able to enter it without necessarily following through on this perceived ideology we work through the systems or the concept we're born into, but then also both being ourselves, but then also this concept of cinema history.
Maybe the best way to address that would be to just use myself as an example and where I got to where I am today. Because when I started wanting to make films, when I was when I hit maybe age 10, I came to the surprising realization that not everyone wanted to be involved in film in one way or another, and that was really quite startling. So I think it is kind of like almost predestination. You know, I've always had this fascination with cinema. I've always wanted to make films. Like some key points when I was age 7, I remember discovering Western films, and that was the reason that was a really big thing for me. And I always preferred older films when I was growing up. You know, I liked the old Hollywood classics, which also set me already though at a very funny in a very funny position to contemporary cinema, in that I realized that a lot of the people I really admired and really enjoyed watching were very old or dead at that time in the 80s. They weren't making many westerns anymore. So, you know, I already, later on in life, I became really preoccupied with this notion of Jean Cocteau's cinema being death at work. But, you know, things like being sort of slightly outside of time, dealing with something that was like a kind of a almost like a seance, or a cinema as kind of a ghost thing. I think that was there, consciously or not, very, very early on. It also sort of made me a little bit of an outsider. So, you know, not only this obsession with cinema, but also this obsession with cinemas that, you know, my friends and contemporaries weren't necessarily that engaged with, also set me apart. So looking back, there was already a lot of formative things happening in my life, which were happening in other ways as well, but just around this concept of cinema, which I think fed into things later on. But, you know, of course, growing up, I wanted to make, you know, as I got older, art house films, but I wanted to make narrative films. And like many people, I started making my first films when I was in school. Again, this would have been the 90s, so it was before everyone necessarily had access to shooting on their phone. You know, it wasn't that accessible. But I got hold of a video camera and I made a couple of films with friends. Films sort of very, 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 very drawn out, very kind of pretentious dramas about teenage angst and things, kind of over-influenced by Antonioni. Or, you know, when you watch Antonioni when you're that young and you see how slow everything is and how long everything is, you think you're doing that, but you make it 20 times longer. So some of them look, oh yeah, we're still doing that, but we know we're doing it now. But anyway, yeah, I'd probably be a little bit too cruel. But the thing is, I shot these films, and then for a while I was in a position where I couldn't make films anymore, and I was looking back over them and looking back over them. And more what I was seeing was how these things intersected in ways with real life, because I would have been hanging around with these friends. This was in rural West Cork in the countryside. And then, everyone kind of drifted away. And I became more aware of the way I was shooting people as sort of portraiture, and then thinking about editing a lot more. It's like the narratives fell away, and I became more interested in the individual shots and the sort of charge which they held. And then, in a very rudimentary way at the time, I just hit on this idea of film as being like an analog for memory. The way, we, again, very simple idea, but the way we think of memories and different images, sounds, events, and juxtapose them. So again, I started re-editing, I started working with this footage and taking the narrative out and focusing more on trying to find structures to put these images together in a way where they just sort of resonate in a more abstract way, as if the way I saw it then, and sort of still in some ways see making my films, is if you see a narrative film and then you fall asleep and you dream about it, it's the dream which you've had after seeing the film, what's really resonated with you, things which has triggered maybe, rather than the story necessarily. But I was doing that in kind of a very rudimentary way, still with very rudimentary tools. And the other thing which I became more aware of is, like, back then, generally I just came in at the very end of the time when, if it wasn't actually shot on film, it wasn't a film, so working on video was still seen as something, it wasn't as accepted as it would have been a couple of years later. Like Dogma 95 had just kind of hit a couple of years back, and that was still just sort of entering the culture. So when I got hold of a camera, and I filmed something and it moved and you could see it and hear it, it was like, okay, I'm making a film. I didn't particularly think in any deep way about what I was working with. But then again, getting more conscious about this, the fact that I was shooting this stuff on home movie equipment began to sort of seep into my consciousness. And the sort of personal way that the camera you're using can affect what you're doing, as opposed to, a sort of industrial model, or working with a crew, or working on 35 millimeters would have been the case back then if you could, real filmmaking. And I became more and more invested in this. And then this became even more apparent when I worked in a place, when I moved up to Cork City, and I'd been to college for a couple of years. I worked in a place called Cork Film Centre for a few years. And a big part of what I was doing was getting people's home movies and transferring them onto DVD for them to watch. And I just became really fascinated watching what seeped onto these tapes somehow. The strange things which people filmed without even knowing it. And, you're just sort of not watching this stuff from start to finish necessarily, but dipping in and out and wondering if they knew the camera was on at that point. Why this empty room? Why? And it just coming up with this idea of the camera as being something between the person filming and what was going on, almost like an alien. And then I had this notion, just try and film the world like an alien who's arrived here for the first time. And, all this stuff is sort of organically seeping in and influencing what I'm doing. And I'm kind of gradually moving further and further away from narrative films. I tried to make a couple of narrative films, in one case a feature. They didn't work. But, I sort of put these processes towards them and re-edited them and came up with, a very different sort of approach, in many cases, to the sort of emotions that I was trying to convey with a narrative. And then it was just sort of gradually building that up. And I went to some very, very strange places in between 2015, 16, and 2018.
Going to strange places? I don't know about that.
I made well, listen to this then. I made a 6-hour film called Scorpion Stone, where I think I just sort of put myself.
I just read about that. Yeah.
Yeah. It's in a number of episodes. It's like found footage mixed in with bits and pieces that I shot, sort of home movies shot during travels, which also had little vignettes acted in. And then I came up with this whole storyline behind it, like this incredibly elaborate B-movie plot, which also brought in, certain elements from Jean Cocteau, this whole sense of being between life and death. And I put this thing together, and part of this, during this time, I was doing a master's in fine art, and it got to the point where at one stage I decided that what I wanted to do was just, when this project was finished, make 6 VHS tapes of it and go out and bury those 6 tapes in 6 locations where I filmed, 6 sort of key locations, and then that'd be it. I'd never show it again. I'd destroy it. I chickened out, but that's kind of how far I went in that direction. So I think I really went to the edge. And then from that point, it was like trying to use cinema almost to tear reality apart. How long could I go with takes, then how short? You know, I really got into a lot of flicker effects at a certain point as well. And then I think after that, things kind of stabilized. It was almost like I'd taken everything apart. Now I had my tools, I had all the pieces there, so how can I start putting them back together again? And since then, the films I've been making, many of them have maybe been, you know, a little bit more within the shape of, say, a traditional feature film, you know, a little bit more approachable, a little bit more structured by my standards. And who knows, you know, one day it's always in the back of my mind, it'd be great to shoot a narrative feature at some point. Why not?
Well, that's funny you say that, because for me, I was nervous about doing the Sublime Hubris, and I really felt like, okay, this is kind of like my pop film, right? Or it's something that's comparatively to some of my other work, where you really think like, all right, I'm kind of doing something a little more, but then when you start showing other people, they're like, oh, this is still very unique and different.
But isn't that wonderful? I mean, you know, that's crucial to the way we make films. You know, we can only make the films that we can make. You know, we have that curse. You know, even if we try to do something else, we still sort of somehow bring it back to this essence which we bring to everything we do. I've definitely experienced that. Another thing which happens to me all the time is I think that I put a lot of humor into some films and then, you know, project them to an audience. And
I do see those moments that pop up where it's almost like there's a sense of the sublime or intensity or unexplained, unrecognizable horror, you know, that a lot of your films will create, and there'll just be a brief moment where you wink, you know, as a creator, as a filmmaker, as a writer, where and we don't have to get into the specifics halfway back. When he said he was the cameraman on porn reels in the 80s, right? And it fit the character, it fit the narrative, it fit the concept. And it was just such a quick line, and you say it twice, and it was like, facts. You know, like I really felt like you can really do those patented winks amongst the severity or the world you create. There's almost still this tiny sliver of joy and love, and it is very human of you. And one thing I noticed when you were talking, I went back through your Senses of Cinema writings. I believe in like 09, you know, 2010. It could be 2011, you know. But I was reading your review on Tarkovsky, or your retrospective or critique, and you were one. I've read quite a bit on people talking about what they love about him, but you were mentioning his how great he is at portraiture and his picturesque capturing of humans and people and faces, stuff like that. And when I showed you Sisyphus and the Abraham, that was something you noticed as well, that you really and what would that have been, 25 years apart, where that's something that catches your eye? What is it about the portraiture within film, or the capturing of the human head, and the look that creates of, because a lot of times you hear about Tarkovsky's length of his film, kind of the thing that Bela Tarr moans when people ask, because they always ask the same thing. Or the movement of his camera, or how poetic the edit is created, where it creates a sense of whether humanism or spirituality. And just listening to you talk about my work, talking about Tarkovsky's work, really enjoying talking about your own history, the concept of the portraiture within film. Can you expand on what it is about that really draws you in enough to notice and appreciate?
Well, I think one of the intrinsic qualities of cinema, which I don't think any other medium can do in quite the same way, I think painting can do it, but in a very different way, is to capture the presence of someone. Um, but it's not the same as capturing them. It's a phantom. It's an apparition. It's something very, very complex. And the more you think about it, perhaps quite unsettling, between the person that's being filmed, the apparatus, and your gaze. Yeah, talk about Tarkovsky and your work as well. But for me, the core of cinema, the essence of cinema, its peak, as the films Philippe Garrel made during the early 70s, or some of them, Les Hautes Solitudes in particular, which is kind of just portraiture. It's a number of people, a number of women, Jean Seberg, Tina Omont, Nico, and it's kind of a flip and almost facetious and very unfair way of describing it, but unfair to Warhol. But I've described these films of Garrel's to people who don't know them as Warhol with a heart. It's what, yeah, that's kind of mean to Warhol. He's doing something quite different, but it is that sort of intensity of portraiture. And there's obviously so much drama going on, and all these people had real life relationships going on, and it was a very, very sort of tense, charged scene with these artists, and there was a lot of drug use and a lot of tragedy. But there's just something immense about the way Garrel can film these people, can film these faces. It's so emotional. And these films are completely silent, or Les Hautes Solitudes is completely silent anyway. And I remember seeing it for the first time in a cinema in Dublin in 2000, and I'd been to in the Irish Film Institute, and I'd been to silent films which played without music there before, and there was always a certain amount of shuffling around. But this one, just the silence, the tension, the audience. And then at the end, when the lights came on, and this total stranger next to me, this young man, just turned, wasn't that amazing? And for me, that's the epitome of that that capacity for capturing,
Yeah.
This sort of strange, mysterious presence. And it is almost like people being taken out of time, as Cocteau said. We're so used to seeing moving images. We're so used to sound and vision and all these things all the time. We even pick up our phones, and it's just at us all the time. It's worthwhile and sometimes quite disconcerting to think about what actually happens, and maybe think about it in a totally different context, in the context of magic. And when I say magic, I'm thinking about the time a few centuries ago when there wasn't really any difference between magic and science. It was just a sense of how you understood things or how you looked at things. If you turn on a light switch, what you're doing is you're commanding energy to spring from this switch to the light bulb and illuminate. And I heard a definition of magic, which was basically causing energies to do your bidding. So, suddenly this thing we do 20 times a day, turning lights on and off, that is actually a magical act. We are causing energy to do our bidding. And we call it science now, and it's become, so normal. Now, that's kind of a fairly simple example compared to this business of actually stealing someone's image and stealing their voice and playing it back and being able to play it back repeatedly and being able to reshape it and recontextualize it and make it do things and tell stories which had perhaps very little to do with the moment in which they were actually shot.
Mm-hmm.
This whole sort of memory things. We are kind of conjuring with phantoms. And certain films, like the Garel films, like your films, like Tarkovsky's films, and that sort of portraiture is, a really good example when you have that concentration and that focus and that consciousness of what's happening, of just what an incredible thing cinema actually is. And what that leads you back to are the immense potentials which it still has. It's not the conventions. And when I say conventions, it's not just like the Hollywood conventions or the TV conventions, but equally the experimental film, any conventions, everything has their conventions. But if you can move whatever field you're working in, if you can somehow move outside of that, it's still about inventing cinema. It's still about this great potential. And everything which I say and hopefully everything which I do, if there's one thing I hope that it can achieve, however crudely, is just to try and break through that jadedness about what cinema can do. And I think in this day and age, again, it's not just, this isn't just a benefit to cinema. I think we're so used to all sorts of conventions of moving image and sound being used to convey certain information in certain ways. It's become part of our thinking and just sort of part of our way of reacting to the world. If through cinema you can be moved outside of that, it can, in a way, serve to re-enchant reality. It can open your mind, it can open your senses, and that's about sort of freedom as well. That's about taking reality back. That's about looking at what you are, how you experience life, and in a way just being able to live your own way. And I know that sounds very grand, and it's not that every time it's going to be a life-changing event, but even by degrees, even in small ways, if a film makes you notice something else that you can then again sort of bring back into yourself and the way you process and see, because the world is so fucked up, always has been one way or the other, probably always will be. As humans, in a way, we have so much potential, but then we're up against so many pressures, and we have to attend to so many things, and we have to deal with so much. What we have is our imagination, our senses, our memories, and that's the one thing which nothing can really take away from us, and where we can be free. And if you can start doing that, maybe it can improve life. It can enrich life. It can make being on this earth a richer and more valuable experience. Now, in the scheme of things, as opposed to opening hospitals for children or something, it's probably down quite a few rungs. But I still think it is worthwhile, this sort of work with the moving image.
One thing I wanted to just touch back with, all of this came from your dream as a 10-year-old, right? That it's this you wanted to make films back then in 7 to 10, you mentioned those ages. Around that time, you said you're watching older films. What were the films you recall standing out to you that you watched that really made you feel like this is what I have to do? Little 10-year-old Max watching.
It was actually before that. It was even when my father was taking me to the cinema for the first time.
Yeah.
And just, I felt like I needed to be part of this even before I understood how any of that worked. As I said, a lot of the classic westerns, John Ford, Peckinpah, Raoul Walsh, Anthony Mann, then Charlie Chaplin, Laurel and Hardy, Fred Astaire, Ginger Rogers, Humphrey Bogart. A lot of these films I'd be seeing on TV. They used to have seasons of films of 6 o'clock on a Tuesday or something, and they'd have a themed season. And I wasn't allowed to just watch TV anytime I wanted either. I think this is probably in retrospect a good thing, even though it drove me crazy at the time. But I had to go to my mother with the TV guide and tell her what I wanted to watch, and that wasn't about censorship. It was just about she wanted me to be able to do other things than watch TV.
Yeah.
Then I was very interested for a while in, sort of the pattern which these things follow is sometimes quite funny. At that time, I was very interested in science fiction and horror. I was obsessed with the TV series Doctor Who at that time. And I think that atmosphere was always there. The sense, really sort of a key to my films in some ways is what Carl Dreyer said about Vampire, about, if you're just in a room and it's a bright sunny afternoon and everything's calm and nice, and then someone tells you there's a dead body in the next room, even if you don't see it, what happens to the atmosphere? I think there's a lot of that in my films. And there's always been the sense of fear and unease wherever that comes from. But that's also quite poetic and a sense of film as being really a haunted space, which I feel it is for reasons I've already touched on. Then when I was around 11 or 12, I think it was 11, I saw 2 movies on TV, and they weren't necessarily the first art movies I saw, but I saw Through a Glass Darkly, Ingmar Bergman, and Spider's Stratagem, Bernardo Bertolucci. And I have no idea what either of them were about, but I was just so overwhelmed by the atmosphere. And it was also a time in life when, you start sort of questioning, you start sort of trying to think about life as well. And somehow these 2 films just totally blew everything open. And up until then, films, but it was all, and that was it, right, this is what I want to do. I want to make films. So I started getting very, very much into art films and watching those. And we moved to the countryside, to West Cork in Ireland, this sort of very scenic but quite remote place. And so everything was like VHS tapes. And I was kind of, again, even more isolated in these interests, swapping pirated VHS tapes. And I got very, very, very intensely snobbish for a while, which I think was a really good phase to go through. But it got to the point where, if it wasn't Tarkovsky or Bresson, it was... and then, that was great. It was like sort of a rigorous boot camp type training where you really think a great deal. And then thank God, Raul Ruiz came and rescued me. I discovered his films, and that was like the return of the repressed, like all the horror and all the science fiction and all the genre stuff and all the sort of joyful stuff of childish dreams and nightmares just came rushing back, and my interest in films sort of broadened out massively, and I got into horror films a lot for the first time. I remember seeing my first Herschel Gordon Lewis film and seeing how a lot of what he was doing equated with some of what Bresson was doing in a very, very interesting way. And since then, really, I have a very, very broad taste and many, many influences. And of course, growing up as well, living in rural Ireland in West Cork, then suddenly discovering Wong Kar-wai's films, and that was like modernity. That was all the beautiful stuff that was happening somewhere else. But at the same time, living in a situation like that, it's also like the Tarkovsky theme park or something, or the Antonioni theme park, and just sort of wandering around, turning these places into film studios in my mind. And then when I started making films, these very rudimentary films for the first time, bringing all that in. So yeah, that was that journey. I don't know how we began on the recounting that journey, but yes. And I'm constantly trying to challenge my own sense of cinema as well. Like I feel I really don't want to get dogmatic, and there's nothing I enjoy more than going back and rediscovering a filmmaker I've dismissed in the past and finding out that I actually really like what they're doing, and I didn't get it before. That's almost more exciting than finding someone new.
Yeah, I refer to that as film as food, where there's times you don't appreciate the taste of something, yet as your palate grows and as you're able to, whether it's stomach longer takes or understand the concept of the pacing or, things like that, it's tough watching a Bela Tarr film if, you've only seen MTV's The Real. The cuts are totally different, and likewise with something either more philosophical, either more, it's like eating spicy food. If you're not ready to bite into fire sauce, you got to start mild, and then you kind of inadvertently, or if you're like me and you love going down that cinema rabbit hole or wormhole, where you just keep ingesting more and more and more, your palate to be able to stomach the more challenging experimental works.
Yeah, and you don't want to eat the same thing every day, and it's kind of unfair to compare.
Unless if it's Taco Bell.
Yeah. We all have those.
Right, the creamy jalapeno sauce is where it's at.
Actually, Taco Bell's, every time I go to the States, I have, I'll have to be honest about this, I have like a bucket list of all the places I want to try at least once, and I still haven't got to Taco Bell.
Yep. What are some of the places?
Yeah, Wendy's is going to open in Europe next year.
Oh, game changer. Good burgers. The Dave's Double is a good way to go. And also there was kind of a last year there was a spicy chicken sandwich craze where it was kind of like Popeyes versus Chick-fil-A. And other places everyone was doing a spicy chicken sandwich, and Wendy's was ahead of the game. They were spicy chicken sandwiching, when I was a kid. They were the OGs of that. But let's just dive into food.
With cinema, it's my other favorite thing, so why not?
Yeah. In Cork, Ireland, what's like, if not the signature dish, the best thing to eat while there? Because I hope to visit in a few years. So that's my goal.
Well, and I'm going to slightly skip around your question, but it is the most honest answer I can give as well. Like many things in Ireland, food's come a long way over the past 20 or 30 years, and Cork is actually a very good place for food.
I do read that, yeah.
And there's a big variety of different types of food you can get. So I guess, what sort of the typical dish or the signature dish is maybe, not the best way to approach eating in Cork.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Like Irish food is very kind of basic in a way, and it really depends on the ingredients. It can be magnificent if it's cooked well. If you get good meat, good potatoes. Mm-hmm. But in Cork, there's just to pick a couple of things at random. There's a wonderful Palestinian restaurant called Is, which is one of my favorites, and they do these dishes. It says on the menu, "This is not a pizza." Best way to describe them is it's very much like a sort of Middle Eastern pizza, and it's wonderful. And their hummus and their just wonderful. And then there's a lot of very good Italian food, which has always been my favorite. A lot of good pizza. 25 years ago, there's maybe one mediocre pizza place in Cork. Now, there's a lot of competition. So it's not, where do I get good pizza? It's what type of good pizza do I want tonight? So yeah, when you come over, we can take you to a lot of good places.
Yeah, maybe in 2 years, give or take, if everything works out. I don't have any calamities or what have you. But speaking of Cork, you are killing it in Cork. You have a how many? Because I know this is your first year opening it to submissions and stuff like that. But have you done like about 5 or 6 CineSalon? And could you describe CineSalon for the millions, I mean thousands, I mean hundreds, I mean all 18 people that are watching this?
I'll try. And in a funny way, I feel more like a custodian than an instigator of what's happening with CineSalon. I'll explain that a little bit more. I've been curating and putting on experimental film events of different types in Cork since 2006 and around Ireland in general. And some of them have been quite successful, some of them have been well received, some of them have been well attended, a lot of them really haven't. But I think up until now, it's probably true to say that whatever we were doing and whatever the context, it was a case of putting something together that was trying to show people something of value and hoping to introduce them to it and start something and bring something in. And CineSalon, the way it began, it was last year sometime, I think it must have been around February or March last year. And it was quite a stressful time with work, with a number of other things, and I was kind of exhausted and kind of, a lot going on. Yeah. I got an email from this guy, Benjamin Burns, who was a friend of a friend, and he said that, he was a poet and he'd made some films and he'd done experimental film as part of his thesis, or for his thesis in college, and he was told that I might be a good person to meet up with. So I said, sure, we'll meet up. And we met, and the evening when we went out, I knew it. I felt this probably isn't a good time to be around people, and especially around people I haven't met before. And anyway, went to the bar, and I liked him immediately, and we started having a couple of drinks, and I hadn't drank anything, and I think I became very morose and quite dark and started complaining about the way things were going. And then it got to a point where in a semi-fantastical vein, it was like, good, well, wouldn't it be great just to forget about everything and just start something where there's nothing other than this platform for showing experimental films and so on. And he said, well, would you like to do that? And I said, yeah. I didn't really pay too much attention to it because that was the mood I was in. But Ben had this really nice energy about him, and I kind of, left, and I thought that he'll never want to speak to me again, this strange, grumpy, middle-aged guy. And then the following week I got a message saying, when should we start doing this? And that was it, it was just this energy, and it was like, yes, we'll do it. And that turned something over, and then it began very organically. There's this amazing artist collective space in Cork called the Guest House, which I could talk about for a very long time. To my mind, it's the most important thing in the Cork arts infrastructure, at least, as regards anything outside of the mainstream. And they have a wonderful, incredibly supportive culture there going back 20 years. And I'd done a lot of screenings there and, had a lot of connections. And but that's kind of a whole other history. But what immediately suggested itself was talking to these people and trying to set something up there. And we did, and they welcomed it. And we made, lists of films we'd like to show, and we thought we'd maybe be struggling to find a full program. But then by the time, we put some names down on a sheet of paper, it was obvious we had like 3 programs there already. And what was really important was throwing it open, and so for artists who screen there to have, to some degree, a sense of ownership. They become CineSalon artists. So what was very important was that once you screen there, it's not like a one-off thing where you're curated into this carefully,
Yeah.
police gatekept gatekept space. um, you can keep coming back. We're here to support you. This is a place where you
Yeah.
can keep doing your work. It's just somewhere where, and it went. We did it, and it was a full house, and it was just received with this incredible enthusiasm. And that happened with every iteration since. Always full houses, always, and just this warmth. And so for the first time since I started presenting experimental film events, I think I feel like we're doing something where the moment is right, and we're kind of serving something which is there in the culture already or needed. We're responding to something, and that's why we're getting such a great response.
Mhm.
So that's what I say when, it's like I feel like we're custodians of it rather than anything else, because I don't fully understand why it's working, but it is working, and it's
Yeah.
working very, very well. And I think it is something that's kind of in the air in Ireland a little bit. I mean, it'll always be a small niche thing, but when Shelley Camille, my partner, and I, we showed some of our films at a place called Gallery X in Dublin as well, which is a small semi-underground gallery space which specializes in figurative art around themes of the occult. Again, this amazing audience. It wasn't just that the room was full; it was the reception and the interest and the enthusiasm. And so after a while, we decided, well, why not take the next step and make it a festival, extend it
Yeah.
a little bit, and also, crucially extend it in a way that it reaches out beyond Ireland. Like, we never said it would just be for Irish filmmakers, but because we found that there's so many and there's such a demand, just organically, it has pretty much had no international component because of the people who are bringing their films. And that was also where your festival, where the Octopus Marquee, was such a huge inspiration, the way you do things online. So, we had this idea of really opening it up, but doing an online program as well. And it seems like the call or the energy or whatever has been responded to. Like, the response to the open call was amazing. We got far more films than we thought we would. Really, really good quality work. Even with like 8 online programs, it was still very hard whittling that down. So we'll see what happens. We're going to keep on the quarterly events at the guest house. We're going to do more events as well, maybe going off in slightly different directions. We're definitely going to do something more with the online platform too. And then who knows, next year, all going well, we might be back for another festival, hopefully.
Yeah. No, I can, so much of life and so much of what hits comes down to both timing, like you were saying, where there's all these filmmakers and all these unique artists, whether it's Cork or whether it's Ireland, that's within this scene, right? But the fact that you guys opened it up almost to the world is huge. you know, um, and I'll send this to you and all this type of stuff. Make sure everything's good. But if anyone's watching this now, there is about another week of the online programs, which is a combination of both Irish and films all across the world that really fit into unique filmmaking, individuality, personal cinema. I can't state enough how unique and important CineSalon is. Um, it's really becoming something that, like, I see the pictures of you guys doing your live shows, and I'm jealous as hell. I wish I was there. and and but it's really something that I'm glad you guys are still doing it. I'm excited for future ones, and yeah, and real quick, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna
Just
move.
in case you try and dodge the fact, I have to say now as well that the CineSalon online program has two very wonderful films by you and a great interview with you as well. So let's plug that and be sure to
Oh,
plug
this,
that.
oh, this whole, oh, that
One of
one.
the highlights.
I appreciate it. So yeah, you said you were curating for quite a few years now. Comparatively to the creativity it takes to both make films and to critique films, I believe that the concept of curating and then also festival directing, uh, there there is kind of an unknown art to what should be where, what's selected, what's this, and then also the drive to, okay, I want to highlight these films. I know, and sorry if I'm saying it wrong, uh, Phantom Scope, Phantascope,
Fantascope, yeah.
yeah, that you did with, that at least I'm familiar with, a few different films at Triskel Art Center,
Mhm.
but then also specifically highlighting CineSalon now that it's a festival and then also the prior screenings we're doing before. Talk about your process of selecting films or combining, okay, this moment leads to this moment, leads to this moment, or this film we would be crazy not to have, this that has been either submitted or is someone that's from the Cork or Kilkenny area that, hey, let's let's put them in this, the art of curation. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
I mean, curating film programs, it becomes quite instinctive. I also work for a youth film festival for bread and butter. Um, so not, I obviously take that work seriously, and I do my very best to create good programs there as well. But I probably don't have the same strong connection I would to the experimental film curation, which is something which I'm doing because I want to.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, it's sort of really good training, and you can sometimes get quite quick at just feeling what will go, what will vibe with other things, and what won't. And really putting together a program of short films is basically editing a feature film. It's like each one of those has to go together as
Yeah.
emotionally coherently as sequences in a feature film. Even though they're totally different, and obviously they have their own integrity, the whole program as well should play as smoothly as a feature. And it doesn't always work out that way for different reasons. But I mean, the different things I've done over the years, sometimes they're different prerogatives and different priorities. Fantascope, unbelievably, Chris O'Neill, who's the head of cinema at
Great
Triskel,
guy.
who's also very fine experimental filmmaker in his own right. He's got some people have said, that he could have been a very good detective because he has this incredible memory for dates and facts and details. And he just sprung it on me the other day that Fantascope, which we're doing next month, is actually the 10th anniversary. So I don't know where all that time went, but it seems like we've been doing that for 10 years. And that's
Ah,
a quarterly slot in Triskel Christchurch Cinema, which is Cork's arthouse cinema, where I've had the privilege of basically being able to screen whatever I like within, financial limitations. That's the big thing. So long as it doesn't cost, I can put pretty much anything I want to on there. And so it's been a balance of classics and different features and new things coming from the Irish underground and from elsewhere. I try and find films that maybe aren't getting screened anywhere else. I was especially delighted this year to be able to show Michael Higgins' 95B, which is one of the best films by anyone made anywhere over the past few years. And it just hasn't been screened at all, and it drives me crazy. I mean, this film is mind-blowing. Um, so, it's great to be able to do those sort of things. Mostly feature format, again, because of cost a lot of the time, because if we're paying screening fees for some things, it actually works out cheaper to get a single feature than, say, half a dozen shorts. Yeah, and that's just sort of moved along, and sometimes it's done well, and sometimes there've been tiny audiences. Another particularly proud moment was, I think, it was last year again, Jeff Keane's centenary, and we were able to bring his daughter Stella Keane over to present a program of her father's work. And Stella's an amazing artist and the custodian of his legacy, and appears in a lot of his films as a little girl as well. So that was very special. I suppose in terms of Cork, the other, and curating in Cork, the other significant thing I was part of was an event called Black Sun, which ran between 2009 and 2013. And that was set up by a close friend and collaborator of mine for many years, Vicky Langan, who started, she was very young at the time, and she was a very young mother as well, with no resources. She started this event where she was bringing performance artists and underground musicians over to Cork to perform for the first time, and sort of really creating a new culture there, bringing something which just wasn't part of the makeup of Cork into the mix. And then she invited me to start doing short film programs along with that. So I was screening things from all over the world, and that was the first consistent thing which I was doing in terms of curating. But what all this really comes down to, curating films, writing about films, making them, it's this sense, and maybe especially growing up in Ireland at the time I was, of there not being anything out there for me. And this is where I really, one of the things which really connected me with Rusba Rashidi and, his project, the Experimental Film Society. And he came from Iran, and it was the same thing. It was just being completely out there on your own. And what are you going to do? You're going to just sit around and feel sorry for yourself, or you're going to get out there and do it and make it happen and try and create the culture which you need to work in, and through that meet other people and maybe show other people possibilities, give people permissions to do this sort of work. So it's all really part of the same thing. It's all just about sort of creating an atmosphere which you can breathe in. And with CineSalon, that's been a lot more easy than almost anything has previously. So that's really, really exciting and gratifying. We'll see if it continues.
Yeah. Well, the irony, you hit on 3 different topics I wanted to talk to you about. So perfect answer. I actually wrote on my notes here, Michael Higgins.
Oh yeah,
this is
Michael.
The segment of the show.
Well, I'll say something. I will interject something else about just experimental film and the zeitgeist here and Michael, and that is the fact that in September there were 3 significant events. There's an organization called Amy, which is kind of in charge of nurturing artist film in this country, and they put on a festival in Dublin, and then Michael was running a series of screening events along with his partner Joanna Robles, who's also a magnificent filmmaker, in Kilkenny. And the fact that all these happened at the same time is really extraordinary. And when we realized this was happening, we got together and we were very supportive. There's no competition. We're all doing things that are slightly different. And all 3 entities were very excited about this happening. The
out of focus film fest that him and Lana are running. I just the looking at the artwork that they were doing as like the fonts, the logos, everything like that, and then seeing stills and the films that were in their films. the fact that it's happening at the same time as any salon, different days or whatever, but just within this month period, it's just so wild. And then to have both yourself, Charles Le Cain, Benjamin Burns, and then over here you have those two. It's just absolutely wild that it's one of those and I'm sure it won't get the same praise or Wikipedia pages, but it's very reminiscent of this French New Wave, where I don't know if we want to call it an I don't know Irish New Wave, or maybe it's not necessarily new, but something where you have all these different filmmakers, and this kind of touches into right place, right time of running these events where you have all these voices. They all have their unique style to them. They all are. I have self-doubt and anxiety issues and stuff, so it takes a lot of bravery to put yourself out there and do something different. And you have all these people, how far is Kilkenny to Cork? An hour?
Oh, no, it's probably more like 3 hours. It's quite a distance, yeah.
So all within this region, and then further to Dublin, is creating such unique and art. But I'm kind of focused on film. It's just so wild, and then just to highlight, Michael Higgins himself. What a good guy. We'll have a logo that us.
Michael's very, very, very special. Real legend. Great filmmaker. Great all round. He makes his living as a colorist mainly. So, he's sort of very, very skilled and very advanced in the latest digital technologies, but at the same time, he's a guy who can get an old tin can and put a hole through it and make a film with that as well. And if I'm exaggerating, I'm barely exaggerating. He has this sort of hands-on DIY approach. It's just such a... And he's really good at finding things and repurposing things. And I think that comes through in his films a lot. And you can really feel the strong spirit in his films, but at the same time, they're all very different. Different sort of approaches, different techniques. I've many, many fun memories of him. One being a film which he made for a gallery show, which I was involved in many years ago. And what he had this old 35mm Russian camera, which looked like a robot's head. There's no way. Probably not allowed to talk about Richard Stanley anymore, but I love Hardware. I love some of his films, and the head of the robot from Hardware. Think of that, but as a camera. And what he had these strips of 35mm still camera films. So you get a few seconds, however many frames, 36 frames in that, and he put those in the camera, and there was no motor on it, so he had a drill, and he just stuck the drill into the side of the camera, and that was how he operated it. So this robot head with a drill sticking, and of course he got wonderful results.
We're to touch into that, and to touch into, you mentioned the Experimental Film Society. I think I don't want to ask something that each one of you guys gets so often in interviews of like, what is it? And things like that. But I'm kind of interested in the very early period where Roosevelt goes from Iran to Ireland, right? How did he meet you? And then also, how did like Kavanaugh and Higgins and all these other filmmakers and all these other artists, what was it that initially connected you guys all together?
Experimental Film Society, as the legend goes, began in Tehran in the year 2000 when Rusper, out of nowhere, started making these films and found himself in a position as someone who was obsessed with film and had this very particular desire to make a type of film that he didn't see anywhere in Iranian culture. It wasn't really video art, it wasn't documentary, and it wasn't narrative film. So again, as I mentioned earlier, like with me in Ireland, it was a case of, well, it's not happening, so you have to make it happen. So he got some people together, and that was the first iteration of Experimental Film Society. A number of Iranian filmmakers working, and Rusper would somehow engage and facilitate, and then they'd have these underground screenings. And then he moved to Ireland in 2004, and as he can tell you a lot better than me, he arrived having been a total outsider who had to leave for a number of reasons, including just finding somewhere where he could express himself artistically in a free way, because the things are very, very repressive there and very difficult, and you can get into like really serious trouble for things which we take for granted in Europe or the US. So he came to Ireland. He was now in Europe, and he had some sort of expectation of arriving and finding this flourishing culture which would just embrace him as film culture. But he found that it was, if anything, worse than Iran, and he couldn't speak English. So starting from scratch again. And then, just gradually he started meeting people. He met Dean Kavanagh and Jan Klavedetcher they were all in Dublin in the same film school. And they started working together, and he mentored them a little bit or a lot. And it was through Donald Foreman, who's now gone on to have a very successful career, a very fine filmmaker, who I was close friends with at the time. We discovered Rusper, someone doing very interesting work, living in Dublin, and made contact. And the three of us came together, Donald, Rusper, and I, and we all had the same frustrations. Even though we were making quite different types of films, we all felt that there wasn't really an adequate platform for us in Ireland. We weren't really getting into festivals, and when we did get into festivals, we'd end up being like the boring downer art house experimental film put in between two comedies and shown to an audience who was there for the comedies. So we came together and formed something called Another Irish Cinema, with the AN in brackets. We were young.
Yeah. I'm fascinated.
And we had these three very different styles, and we started screening, basically doing what Experimental Film Society came to do shortly afterwards, just contacting people all over the place, curating programs of our films, the three of us, and getting them screened in different festivals, different venues, and just putting in the legwork. And we got some traction with that, and that worked well for about a year. But I think, and maybe Donald or Rusper would disagree with me, but I think what perhaps happened was that Rusper and I began interacting and influencing each other to an extent that maybe it didn't work as a three-part thing anymore. Like Rusper and I were becoming too close, and maybe Donald felt at a certain point that perhaps he wasn't such a good fit. So, organically, we never had a falling out or anything, but just organically, we sort of stopped doing it.
Yeah.
And what I brought to Rusper's practice was I corrupted him. He was doing these very beautiful, very slow, sort of minimalist, semi-documentary character study things, with a lot of Bresson, maybe Peter Emmanuel Goldman, that sort of vibe to them.
I watched Only Human.
Yes. Yeah, one of his early ones. So the style that was what he was doing back then. And I, at that stage, had got, I was very influenced by horror films and Paul Sharits and that sort of thing at that time. So that was where my head was at. And I corrupted Rusper because he really took to horror films, and this sort of completely changed his way of working. And likewise, I was sort of getting an influence from him. And we just started working really well together. And then, he's a human dynamo. he's just got such an incredible energy, and yeah, he us together, but sort of with him as always sort of the driving dynamo behind it, started doing screenings, started doing all the things which we did, and then after 10 years, it was also coming from a place of real desperation at that time. Like, we were complete outsiders. No one would ever want to watch our films. No one would ever. And then, as we started doing this and pushing, then a couple of astonishing things happened. Like, we actually started getting grants to make these films, and if a little bit of appreciation from the institutions and the establishments, and we got a foot in a couple of places. And this was, and it just sort of kept ramping up and ramping up. And then I suppose after 10 years, we had, several hundred screenings in Ireland and abroad. We did a couple of books. We had a sound project involving some of the others as well, called Cinema Cyanide. Exhibitions, live performances, all these things. But it was all, and you ask about how we got to know each other. It was basically curated by Rusba. He'd invite people in who he thought were a good fit, and sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't work so well. But there really was this energy, and it was like this extraordinary lab where we were all working together, and sort of shooting first and asking questions afterwards. Like, there was a lot of thinking, there was a lot of theorizing, but it always came out of making, and
Yeah.
we were very prolific, and he was insanely prolific. Like, he made something like a dozen feature films one year. But again, that also slightly stemmed from desperation. It was just like spending 2 years, going through all the procedures, getting the money, sort of making all these compromising things. Fuck you, I can make 13 features in a year. I can make a feature in 2 days. Fuck you. We've mellowed since then, but it was great to go through that. And that was really just coming from this mindset of, no one could ever possibly be interested in what we were doing. It's this or suicide. But it was great. It was such an intense few years. And then, things happened, and the pandemic happened, and that phase of Experimental Film Society just kind of came to an end now. He's doing the Experimental Film Society Film School. He's gone on to become an educator, and that's really where his energy is. And some of us, myself, Michael, Dean, who hasn't been involved for a few years, Atusa Pohoseni, we're all still doing well. We're still doing what we did.
I saw you guys hopping in a picture recently.
Sorry?
I saw you guys, Rusba and yourself, with the CineSalon screening and stuff like that. The idea of separating, but then you're still friends. So it's like just human nature, life of growing old, and
absolutely. And CineSalon feels like it was very interesting listening to Rusba talking about those years of working with Experimental Film Society. And he did, let's be honest, he did pretty much burn himself out in the end. He just did so much. He just pushed and pushed.
I bet. Yeah.
Broke through so many boundaries, and it was kind of like forging the experimental film culture. You talked about a new wave. I think we sort of felt like a new wave. We were something new. We weren't everything, and we were something perhaps in some ways a little bit closed. But within that, there was such a fantastic energy. And Rusba's talking about how he couldn't really have gone on to teach without having gone through all that and learned all that. And in kind of the same way, I feel with CineSalon in relation to Experimental Film Society, we did this really, really intense, hard thing that was, with this sort of incredible energy, but at the same time, it was very concentrated. Whereas now with CineSalon coming to that, it's a lot more open. It's a very different thing. But I think without Experimental Film Society and without those ideas and that sort of energy, they could never have moved on to CineSalon. And who knows, I think the influence, conscious or unconscious, of Experimental Film Society has been huge and continues to be. And I'm really happy that Rusba's teaching now. You know, he's such an inspiring guy, and he has so much to give to younger filmmakers.
And I just the concept of, as filmmakers, as cinematic minds, um, and as human beings, as we grow and we go through these journeys, uh, trials and tribulations and everything, um, that you end up on a path, and you end up where sometimes there's this new chapter or this new beginning. It doesn't necessarily mean that new chapter is a bad analogy, because that indicates the sheer end of something. I I watched a film you submitted to the Octopus Marquee like an hour before we started recording this, and I paused it right away because I had such a smile. Um, there was the EFS logo, and then there was the CineSalon Presents, and I just took a moment to think, we are seeing another chapter in the in the journey of watching Maximilian films, right? And in this idea that you're not different, you grow and you age and everything, but this idea of, now whether that was what, when you talked about being at the bar, with, I'm guessing, Benjamin, or a different friend, maybe.
Oh,
Um, a different, what was it?
that was Benjamin. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So meeting Benjamin and having this moment where you're just like, whether it was in relation to that or different, but just for sake of me rambling, um, to be able to, all right, I see another direction I can go, where it ties into myself, my history, my past, but I'm going forward. And selfishly, I'm so excited to see what that all brings. Because you are a great voice. You are somebody that, not just in terms of the film, what you create, but I can tell in your heart and in your soul who you are as an individual, based off of our conversations, based off of everything. I can tell you're someone that everyone that has the opportunity to get to know you past your works, but then also just your works, is something that everyone that has the benefit of experiencing that is lucky. And uh, thank you. And I am excited going forward that even the works that you're cautious of and you throw together and you're kind of nervous of are amazing. And then the works that, now they're Hegel's five arts, which then became the seventh art, but whether you look at cinema as you're sculpting things together, whether you look at it as a literal building of, here's pieces of sound, here's pieces of this, whether you're looking at it as a painting or a dance, whatever interpretation that we inadvertently, through the ideologies we're born into or forced into, whichever outlook we unknowingly look at cinema through, each one of those forms and each one of those concepts of interpretation can see your work and your your drive to create, but then also just who you are and what you do uh, can be appreciated and people can learn from.
Well, thank you very much. And as you know, probably better than most people, and I say this as well because of your festival and the whole ethos behind it and the way you interact with filmmakers. When we're making these sort of films, it does sometimes feel like we're speaking to ourselves a lot. I'm here in my little room, do these films. Maybe half a dozen people see them, maybe more people see them, but it's not like it goes out and finds a big audience. So it's all about personal connection. It's all about these films are addressed to individuals and how people respond. Hopefully these films are open enough that people can respond in a way that's very particular to them as well. In an interview Rusba did recently, he said it's beautiful to make a film for 15 friends, and maybe that's all there is. But it often feels that, if one person gets it or appreciates it, then for this sort of personal filmmaking, maybe that's enough. So thank you so much.
Yeah, well,
Great to have you watching.
and you as well. And I mean, you mentioned just like the 10 or 15 people watching or whatever. It makes me think of, as I'm putting a film together, that and a lot of what I do I've been thinking of for a long time, whether literally or just an expression of myself, you know. And then seeing the Vimeo analytics, and it's like, okay, I sent it to whatever, and then seeing that number go from 1 to 5 to 8 to 12 or whatever, and then it's like, okay, yeah, I'm hopefully, whether it's the acceptance of festivals, whether it's the whatever, but the fact that there's a very small number of people I trust in terms of on an emotional level, but then also on a psychological or artistic level to send stuff to and just be like, hey, I'm like 90% there. Is this jump cut too jump cutty, or is it not jump cutty enough?
Yeah.
But that kind of the concept of sending things to people and working with stuff. You mentioned, I apologize to her if I'm saying her name wrong. Vicky Langan.
Langan, yeah.
Your guys' collaboration, and that's spawned for a decade plus.
Decade plus, yeah. Maybe 12 years or so.
50, and I know you talked about this in an interview already that I watched before. The concept of collaborating and working with people. But on a literal level, whether it's someone you're working with, where okay, you're the actor, I'm the this, and we're melding our brains together, or if it's like an exquisite cork or something, what is your comfort zone on? Okay, there's two people and we both have creative control. And that might be a weird way to phrase it, but hopefully that makes sense.
It's a good way. I've had some very successful and satisfying collaborations, and I think part of this comes from, well, two things. One, I've done so much solo stuff. I've done so much stuff on my own, including literally on my own, filming myself, doing everything, that I feel if I'm going to be working with someone else, I want something else to be happening, or for the other person to be bringing things in. And the other thing is just the people that I collaborate with. I have to trust them completely. and just sort of see what happens. If I'm not going to do that, then why am I working with them? So I don't really have sort of a concept of collaboration or a
Sure.
50% this, 50% that. Like working with Vicky for a number of years, that was pretty special in that we just seemed to have this connection where I wouldn't, she was coming at it first from performance and I was doing the filmmaking part of it. Then as things went on, those lines blurred a little bit. But, I asked her what space she needed. Okay, so where are you going to move from here to here? So if I put the camera here, and then it just sort of happened, and then I'd go away and edit the stuff, and then she'd come in, and I remember I'd prepare a first cut, and she'd come in and we'd sit together, and when she was watching the cut, I wouldn't look at the screen, I'd look at her face, and I could read. And when I saw that, maybe at first she wasn't even able to articulate what was wrong, but just that reaction, it was like, okay. And that was almost always something I'd be feeling as well. There was something just not working there. But then, it's different with everyone else. I've made a number of collaborative films with Rusba. They've always been more like A side, B side. Okay, you go away and make something this side, and I'll go and do this, and then we'll put them together, and we won't interfere with each other.
Alpha, Omega.
Yeah. Then working with certain sound artists, Karen Power and Mick O'Shea are two people I work with a lot, and I completely trust them. I just give them the film and tell them go away, and then when it comes back, maybe just a few small tweaks. But it's there isn't much. I know that they'll be able to experience the film in a way that they really get it and sort of translate that into what they're doing and enhance it. So yeah, it's really about the people, and then it's also satisfying sometimes, as I'm sure yourself. I've heard from your interviews when you're working with people and you have certain roles, but the roles aren't sort of that prescribed that you can do something else as well, and we can all muck in a little bit. I generally, almost always, 98% of the time, I do my own camera work, but one big exception was a movie called Inside, where I had Dean Kavanagh doing the cinematographer on that one, and he did an amazing job, and he brought a lot to it. Sorry?
Back when you had a buzz cut. Back when
I had a buzz cut.
Yeah.
Exactly. But at the same time, I felt that if I needed to jump in and shoot something, that was fine too. And then I mean, there's so much happens by chance if you're open and you're kind of improvising. You go on set. The way I work, you go on set, you know what you need. You have like a list of what you have to get out of a scene. Mm-hmm. But then you just have to be super open to everything, to all the opportunities. Yeah. And, it's being a filmmaker, being a director is incredibly vulnerable. And this is something whenever I'm talking to students, I always really emphasize, because, we all have to sort of seem, especially if we're working in the industry, we have to put on a thing of being in control and always knowing best and always knowing everything. But, so much of the best stuff in films happens through chance, not through pure chance, but through the circumstances. Like thinking back on Inside, there was one thing Dean wanted to shoot. Dean, he's a brilliant filmmaker in his own right. Really one of the best in Ireland by far. And I had no interest in it. And I actually went away and made some. I said, well, if you and Vicky want to do that, that's fine. I'll go and make some tea. What tea would you? So I went and made tea and snacks, and then came back, and I still thought, in my arrogance, but that fitted into the film well. And then another thing which happened on that was we did a camera test, because this camera we had a really cool slow motion setting. And we shot the scene we wanted to, and it's like, hey, let's mess with this and let's just do that. So we got Vicky to stand in the window, and then she turns around and she has this expression on her face. And we thought, yeah, maybe we can use this for something. wasn't totally throwaway. But then that ended up being the final shot of the film, and there's
Oh,
no way
wow.
in hell I could have made that film work without that shot. It's just things like this. You have to be so receptive. You have to let things come to you. You have to let other people have their heads sometimes as well, because you never know what you're going to get, what's going to happen.
Yeah, the joy of meticulously planning stuff, and give or take. And then it's that, and this was in like Sisyphus and the Abraham, which you're one of the few people that's seen, so the specifics won't make sense to people.
It's great.
But
I'm still
when,
digesting it.
okay, yeah, when I was going up the stairs, in the suit, pushing up the imaginary boulder, um, uh, I it was fluorescent lighting, so we shot it I set it up. My wife would hit the record button, and it was shot at a certain shutter speed, so you wouldn't get those fluorescent light
Banding.
moving parts, right? Um, and the focus was a little different, but that take was the one where it's like, oh, that actually works best. You know, how much of your films is planned, how much is in the moment, and how much is retroactive viewing, appreciating, and inserting.
Well, it depends, but I suppose very, very generally speaking, there are two ways of working. One, the films which are made over a lot of time, maybe just picked up from things which I shoot here and there, maybe things which I just film randomly, and then they start cutting together and an energy grows around them, and then maybe it looks like they might actually become a film, and then I perhaps go out and shoot things more deliberately for that. But then other ones, and most of my recent features, and especially if I'm working with other people and there's a schedule, and you have to respect people's time. I have, and again, I always think back to the shoot of Inside, because I had one of these on Inside. I had 5 pages of notes. I had a list of scenes, and in that, beats, things which I needed to get from each one of those. And I used to call it the script. And every time I said the script, Vicky and Dean would start laughing at me, get very, very defensive. So, but that for me, that is the script. But as I said, that's just setting up sort of what you need to get from every scene. And once you're there on set, sometimes things can go in a totally different way. That can just be a springboard towards something much more interesting that happens in the moment. It's about being open, but also going into a situation where you're not just totally at a loss. When where you have some sort of safety net of knowing,
Sure.
at least what the bare minimum is. And then, a lot of the time, the way I work with performers, and I've been so lucky. I've worked with, so many amazing people. Aisling O'Connell, who appeared in a number of my recent films, as someone else who has to be mentioned. I'm like, wow, just set the camera up, and you can go away, make some tea, look at your phone, and come back in 10 minutes and stop the camera rolling and not even check it back. That's fine. Yeah, that's obviously I'd never do that, but it's just giving performers a space.
Fantastic.
Yeah, just people that the camera really likes. I'm nothing at all against trained actors, but generally the people I tend to work with tend to be artists from other fields, performance artists or musicians or visual artists, because I think they're perhaps more open to just immersing themselves in the project and letting something happen. Whereas, with trained actors, and, I've had great collaborations with trained actors like John McCarthy, for instance, who I worked with extensively over, God, I can say it now, over
Bristolian of you, working with the when I say models, I don't mean, like runway, but like people that fit within, like in a Bressonian sense, Robert Bresson, someone that fits that role of the model within that. So yeah, I can see a lot of that.
And then also playing stuff yourself sometimes because there's no one else to do it. Sometimes because you couldn't
Yeah,
possibly ask anyone else to do it.
uh-huh, uh-huh.
I
It
know.
helps. It helps when you have a good relationship with the person, where it's like, hey, can you spit out this mouthful of oatmeal, or whatever.
That's pretty mild compared to some of the things.
Yeah, I know, right?
I
Yeah.
mean, for me, a moment which always comes back to me in terms of filming yourself and just the craziness of this sort of, one-person band way of making films was in 2008, 2009. I had to take a shot. I had to take a shot of a toy eyeball in my anus, and I was on my own in a room trying to frame that. And if you've got the camera there, I mean, can you and trying to light it in
Someone
such a
watched
way?
it, and
Yeah, there was no way of seeing what was happening, and I needed to get that pretty full on in the frame. And yeah, that was a night where you really do start wondering about your own sanity. I mean, how many takes when you
you
move
literally
slightly?
about the brown
Is,
eye.
yeah, just the most difficult thing in the world to film if you don't have anyone else there.
Oh yeah, you can't. Yeah,
The
you
absolute
don't have
blind spot.
monitors stuff, so you just like bend and pray.
Yeah, I mean, the monitor was behind me. There was nothing in front of me. It was just take after take after take until I finally got it.
Whatever I do, don't sneeze. Well, I think that ties into the next one. It's tough choosing. It's like picking your favorite baby. So hopefully I phrase this right. I don't want to say your favorite film, but like what film or scene or art, if not your most proud of, but uh, significantly stands out to you in your head when you think of your own work and what you've done.
It's a very difficult one because,
Mhm.
films are like kids. You think you know them, you think you own them, you think you form them, you think that they're reflections of you, but they actually have a life of their own. And, they can misbehave and they can run around and tell people all sorts of embarrassing things about you that you never thought. And I have this relationship watching my work. I'm not someone, I know some people have a lot of difficulty watching their own work. I used to. I'm not so bad at it now. But I do find that it goes through the cycle of watching something and say I'm dissatisfied with it and, it's not what I wanted it to be and all the rest of it. And then if I watch it again, I'm suddenly pleasantly surprised and I think, oh, actually, this really isn't bad. There's something happening here. I go away feeling happy. And then I watch it again and suddenly I'm really disappointed again.
Yep.
Um, that yeah, that tends to happen. Um, one thing, so with that as sort of a preamble, maybe objectively, I don't know if it's what I'm most proud of, but the one thing I can be objective about, and I'm not just saying this, I honestly think Scorpion Stone might be unwatchable for anyone, which was kind of the nature of it. It's like this messy, unfinished 6 hour series of tapes. I've shown it in gallery contexts as well. It's always going to be unfinished, and I can't think about it too much because I feel like I might somehow be drawn back to it.
Mhm.
There's kind of a curse associated with it, but I will say that certainly up to that point, I really put everything into that. All my thinking about film. That's the one where I just really pushed it and really sort of pushed it regardless. And it was kind of liberating afterwards in that I felt, okay, now I've done that. I've gone as far out as I can. I don't owe anything to anyone. And since then, I've been a lot calmer with my work. I think I've done things which are, probably more about engaging with the public, perhaps somewhat kinder to
Yeah.
viewers, something um, something more like that. But I think, yeah, whatever happens, the fact that I did Scorpion Stone means that I went there with that one, um, and it took a long time. So maybe that's it. I don't know that it's my
Sure.
favorite. I don't particularly like going back to it for the reasons I've just said. There's
Mhm.
something slightly tricky about it for me mentally. It's a bit of a black hole.
Sure.
But then, there's some where I think maybe I did a good job. There's a film I did with Vicky called Brine Twice Daily, which I have a lot of affection for. I think that one came together very nicely, and there's a nice energy, a nice sense of our friendship in that one. Um, I'm kind of proud of Blist as well because I really
Phenomenal.
that was pushing new ground in Irish cinema in a way. I love some of the performances in Solitaire. There's always something. I mean, I'm tempted to fall back on that old chestnut of my favorite one is the next one, but I actually
Yeah.
always have a lot of terror about the next one as being
Yeah.
maybe that's all. Maybe the next one isn't going to work. But having said which, the next one in this case I am super excited about because it's a collaboration with Le Cain, Shelley Camille, my
Nice.
partner. It's going to be a very, very different film. It's called Now and Forever. We've been working on it. It's actually overdue. It was supposed to be finished. We've just different things. There's been a
Oh,
lot
for
of
sure.
delays in finishing editing. But it's kind of a psychedelic, semi-documentary, experimental science fiction film about marriage. And our marriage is a big, our wedding is a big part of it. We went to Las Vegas and um, created the ceremony. So it's all about that. It's actually the film. Another thing I really like about it, and I hope this isn't in any way impeding it being finished. I feel it's got the best pitch of any film I've ever done. So it's actually one I
Really?
like talking about. Whereas normally, people, oh, what's your latest film? Dark, and that's pretty much all of it. But Now and Forever does have a nice pitch. It's these um, two stories. One about the inception of the Irish race, and this totally fabricated thing. The way
Yeah.
the Irish race came along was one day a priestess washed up on the shores of Ireland, and there was no one else in the country at that time. And she decided what people were sure to need is marriages sooner or later. So she starts performing marriage ceremonies between stones and marrying all these rocks. And then one day a priest washes up and they get married, and that's the beginning of that. So there's this sort of historical Irish version. And then
Yeah.
there's a science fiction thing, which is basically based all around this notion of the wedding industry in Vegas being basically aliens are behind it. And what they do is they come to Earth and they take bets on the happiness or otherwise of people's marriages. So people getting married in Vegas is all basically a gambling scam for aliens. So it's taking these two ideas and then taking them off in all sorts of crazy directions, and it's going to be very psychedelic, and I think it's going to be a
Nice.
lot of fun. I
Um,
just have to
if you
finish
don't mind asking, how did you two meet?
it. Online. Um, yeah,
That's
it
me and
was
my
just
wife.
one.
We did the internet too. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, it was through we knew of each other,
yeah.
and then we had sort of followed each other on Instagram, and we started talking about movies. As Shelley mentioned the other day, our first conversation was about Jean Rollin, the French horror movie director, who's one of my great influences. So he was sort of there at the outset, and something sparked, and here we are. Like a couple, it all went very quickly,
Yeah.
and it's been nearly 6 years now. Most of that time long distance because of the pandemic and one thing or
Sure.
another. But just over a year ago, Shelley moved over, and so we're
Nice.
here in Cork and doing movies and doing festivals, and
Mhm. You
hopefully
two
one
are a
day
power
we'll finish
couple.
on forever.
Mhm. Awesome. Well, I think the the idea of love and the future is a good spot to end the recording here. I want to thank you for joining us. And I'll put all you just send me all the links and everything that you want me to highlight. But anyone that is watching and still has this on, um, yeah, the CineSalon Maximilian. I'll put your website on here too. You have video on demand page through EFS. Um, yeah, I'm excited for for that film you're talking about, all the future films, and yeah, just going forward. I think this is an awesome thing.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for joining me, man. And 3, 2,
Cut.
1. I'll hit the button.